Hi, everybody. Welcome back to this week's lectures on rationalism. Today, we'll take a look at an example of a rationalist in René Descartes and provide an argument for why you may want to be a rationalist. So remember, we're looking at epistemology and this question of how do we justify knowing something. Last week was a look into empiricism that justified knowledge through experience. And this week we're focused on rationalism, which says you can justify knowledge by thinking about it. It's through the intellect and reason and logic that you can come to know something is true. In this sense, then, rationalists believe that knowledge can be attained a priori, prior to experience. As you mentioned, a prime example of a rationalist can be found in René Descartes, who we've looked at previously. Now, remember Descartes' background, right? He was fascinated with mathematics. If you've been exposed to the Cartesian coordinate system, that is from Descartes. And one of the things he admired about mathematics is that within mathematics, you see that with a few assumptions, a few axioms, underlying truths, you can extrapolate and build a house of knowledge based upon a few basic truths. If you open up any geometry text, they'll define what a point is and define what a line is. And then by those basic truths, it expands and provides more knowledge simply through reason, right? Simply through logic. Well, Descartes wanted to do the same thing with all of his truths. He wanted to do the same thing with all that he knew. In order then to come to a good, solid house of knowledge, a good, solid body of knowledge, he wanted to chip away all the beliefs he had until he found the only beliefs he could not throw away from doubt or through doubt. So this was his method of doubt. He doubted everything that he could doubt until he came to the only beliefs he could not doubt. And if he couldn't doubt it, then this must be true, he told himself. Right? So this was his method of doubt. And through this method of doubt, when he finally gets to underlying truths that he thought he knew for certain, we see an example of being a rationalist, right? So we'll take a look at Descartes' approach to coming to these three truths. For the first one, we've already looked at in the beginning of our course. And then we'll discuss other reasons why people believe rationalism is the approach, the correct approach to knowledge. So a possible final exam question might be the following. Descartes is one of the most famous rationalist philosophers. Based on our reading and class discussion of Descartes' second meditation, what are his first three absolute truths? And explain his arguments for them. Okay, so the first one we know from previous lectures, right? He says, doubtless then I exist since I am deceived, and let him deceive me as he may, he can never bring it about that I am nothing. So as long as I shall be conscious that I am something, so that it must, in fine, be maintained, all things being maturely and carefully considered, that this proposition, I exist, is necessarily true, each time it is expressed by me or conceived in my mind. So what is he saying here? Remember, his first truth is about his own existence, that he exists. And how does he come to that truth? Well, as he's doubting all of his beliefs, as he's doubting everything that can be doubted until he gets to what can't be doubted, he notices something. He notices that he is doubting this entire time. And even if he doubts that he's doubting, well, there again, he's doubting. So he cannot doubt that he is doubting, right? Rationally speaking. Well, what does that imply, he says? It implies that I must be here doing the doubting. That even if I'm deceived by some evil demon manipulating my mind, even if I'm deceived by my sense experience, there must be something that is being deceived. Therefore, I exist, he says. I think, or in this case, I doubt, therefore I am. Notice it's a rational argument. He's not making a conclusion about reality based on experience. He's coming to a conclusion about reality based upon his sense of logic. based upon how it has to be logically true that he exists, at the very least to be doubted or to be doubting. Well, being a true rationalist, right, he's going to build his house of knowledge, his body of knowledge from this basic truth using reason. Well, what else can you conclude to be true if you know you exist? If your first truth is that you exist, or that you think, therefore you exist, you doubt, therefore you exist, what else can you know for sure? Well, let's think about the type of I that exists. What sort of thing is this I? Asked Descartes. Is this I a rational animal? Well, I mean, I might say I'm rational, but I have no reason to believe I'm an animal, right? I can't know that for sure. Am I a human being? Well, I know I'm a being, but I can't for sure say I'm a human being. What is it that I know for sure about this I? What is essential to this I that I believe exists? Well, notice his logic for his first truth. I think, therefore I am. I doubt, therefore I am. What sort of I is that thing? Well, that I must be a thinking thing, right? That I must be a doubting thing. Therefore, right, while I'm not sure if I'm a human being, while I'm not sure if I'm a rational animal, I know for certain that whatever I am a thinking thing, right? I am some sort of mind. Notice again, he comes to this conclusion just based upon reason. And this third truth, what is this third truth? He provides to us this example of wax. Take a piece of wax and melt it, he says. All the sensible properties change, yet we still believe, we still take the wax to be the same thing. What does this prove? In Meditation 2, paragraph 11 through 16, what's this whole conversation of wax about? Well, the key here is that last sentence, yet we still believe, we still take the wax to be the same thing. Well, how do you know that the melted wax is the same wax that was there before it was melted? Think about this. According to this, says Descartes, this shows that knowledge of physical things, like this wax and the fact that it's here in puddle form and it was there in a more solid form, that knowledge of physical things is based on the mind, right? We need to think to know the physical world. When you take a look at this puddle of wax after it's melted, the texture has changed, the smell has changed because it's been burnt, the um, the hardness or softness of it has changed. The temperature of it has changed. Color has changed. So all the sensible properties are different between what we see after the melting and prior to the melting. If the sensible properties are completely different, our senses should be telling us that they're two different things here. But how do we know that this puddle of wax was the original stick of wax? It's because rationally, when we think of it, it's through our reason, it's through thinking about it that we know that they're the same. So even through experience, when we say we know something through experience, it's really through the thinking about the experience that we know something. Our concept of the physical world is not a bundle of sensible qualities, but the product of our thoughts. So do you now see his third truth? Knowledge cannot come from the senses. Knowledge comes from our thinking, right? Our intuitions of the mind. It comes from our reason, as we've seen Descartes show us in establishing his first three truths. Can you see now why Descartes is a prime example of a rationalist, coming through conclusions based upon reason, rejecting the senses because we know they can fool us, right? And then believing in certainty, that there are truths that can be known for certain. Take a look at this example. If you know that the sum of a bunch of angles is 108 degrees, say within a triangle, can you tell me what the angle is for angle C, right? Given that angle A is 120 degrees, and given that angle B is 34 degrees? I mean, sure you can, right? You would probably take 108 degrees and then minus the sum of 120 and 34, right? So 180 minus 154. So 26 degrees. C must be 26 degrees. That third angle of the triangle must be 26 degrees. Now think about how you came up with that answer. How did you know that? How did you come to the conclusion that angle C was 26 degrees? You thought about it, right? You just use your intellect. You use reason to come up with that third angle. But if you're an empiricist, what's the only way of knowing what that third angle is? Well, if you're an empiricist, you know through experience, so you'd have to measure it. Now think about that. Is that the most efficient way of getting to that knowledge? Is that even the most accurate way? If you physically measure it, is that really more accurate than just thinking about it? Take a look at the next example. Let's say you have a pet mouse and you want to build a little cool bridge in his cage, like from one side of some rocks to another side within the cage. So you go to the mouse hardware store and you see planks that are 2 inches long. They're like little planks that you can put to form a bridge for your little mouse house. Well, if you know that one of the planks is 2 inches long, how would you find out how long of a bridge you can make with two planks? Well, if one plank is 2 inches long, I can make a 2 inch long bridge. If I have two planks, you could probably make a 4 inch long bridge, right? How would you come up with that? How would you know that? Well, you probably just thought about it. Two planks, 2 inches long each, 2 times 2, 4 inches. It's through reason, it's through logic, it's just through thinking about it, through your intellect. But if you are an empiricist and you have to use your sense experience, how would you determine how long of a bridge you can make with two planks? I guess you'd have to put them side by side and measure them. Is that the most efficient way of doing it? Is that even the most precise, or, you know, the best way of doing it? Isn't it more precise? Wouldn't you get a more accurate answer by just doing 2 times 2 equals 4 inches? Notice what we're doing here. We're able to expand our knowledge using just logic, right? Remember that one of the problems with empiricism is perception. You can be fooled by perceptions. Here, you don't have to worry about perceptions, being fooled by them to expand your knowledge. You can expand what you know just through your sense of reason, just through your logic. If we know all fruits have seeds, and we know an apple is a fruit, right? We just know all apples are fruits. Can we know anything else through just thinking about it? Well, hopefully you see that you can also know that all apples have seeds, right? If all fruits have seeds and an apple's a fruit, then apples will have seeds in them. And you can know that just by thinking about it, just by coming to a conclusion through an argument, right? Which is what we've been using throughout our entire term, as arguments. You have some premises and you can come to a conclusion just by thinking about it, and you expand your knowledge. If you're an empiricist, how would you know that all apples have seeds? Would you be able to know that? Would you be able to go look at every single apple ever? Here's another example. If we know that the murderer was at the restaurant wearing size 10 shoes, if you know that Joe was the only person at the restaurant wearing size 10 shoes, can you expand what you know to come to more conclusions? Well, sure. Using reason, using the intellect, you can hopefully see that Joe must be the murderer. Right? Don't we do this in courtrooms all the time? Don't detectives do this? Gather evidence and then use their sense of reason, deduction, logic to expand their knowledge to come to a conclusion? We don't need a video camera there at the restaurant. We don't need an eyewitness there. If we know that the murderer was at the restaurant wearing size 10 shoes, if we know Joe was the only person at the restaurant wearing size 10 shoes, then just by sheer reason, you can know that Joe was the murderer. You see how useful this is. You see how rationalists say that this is very powerful of a tool. Again, you don't have to come to a conclusion based upon perception, which can be faulty. You can come to it just by reasoning. You can expand your knowledge through reason. Now, how would we know these conclusions are true? Descartes' language would be something like the following. You know it through the intellect, because the mind can grasp things, or sometimes the mind grasps things with clear and distinct certainty. How do you know Joe is a murderer? Because based upon the premises, we can see with clear and distinct certainty that he had to be the murderer, right? If all fruits have seeds and apples are fruit, how do we know that all apples have seeds? Because you see it's clear in your mind's eye, right? Another way of thinking about it is that you can't imagine anything, you can't imagine it not being true, right? You can't imagine it not being true. But it's because of this sort of sense for what's true that the rationalists will then claim to be able to access necessary truths. And then what do you mean by that? Well, if you're an empiricist, all of your truths are contingent upon your experience, right? What you believe is true isn't necessarily true because it's dependent on you experiencing it. And we know that you could be off, you can be wrong, right? You hear a noise and you think it's an intruder, and it's actually just the creaking of the floors of an old house that you're living in, right? So what you know is contingent upon your experience. And we also know we all are a little bit different, so we all might have different experiences. This is a problem for truths if you're an empiricist, say the rationalist. You can't know things, you can't know truths that are necessarily true, that have to be true. You can only know truths contingent upon your experience, and your experiences can be faulty. So the rationalists say, look, we know some things that just have to be true, regardless of your bias, regardless of you and your point of view. It doesn't matter. These things just have to be true. Can you think of any such examples of necessary truths? Truths that just have to be true? What about a bachelor's unmarried male? Doesn't that just have to be true? Doesn't it come to you with clear and distinct this perception that it just has to be true? A bachelor isn't unmarried. It just is. It's not dependent upon experience. You don't have to survey every bachelor. It's just necessarily true, and you know that through reason. A sister's a female sibling. Again, can't you see it that it just has to be true? I mean, there's no way it's not true, right? A sister's a female sibling just has to be true. It's a necessary truth. And you can't get there through experience, right? You can't get there by doing measurements and doing tests, and you can't survey every single sister in existence. No, you know it because you can think about it, and it just has to be true through your sense of reason. What about this? 2 plus 1 equals 3. How do you know 2 plus 1 has to equal 3? Because it makes rational sense. Rationally, we can come to this necessary truth. It's not dependent upon anything. It doesn't matter what culture we grew up in. It doesn't matter, if I just came out of the cold and went inside a hot house. 2 plus 1 equals 3. It necessarily has to be true, independent of experience. It's not contingent upon it, not dependent upon it. And how about this? 2 is more than 1. Right? I get 2 apples, it's more than 1 apple. I get 2 cars, it's more than 1 car. I get 2 chairs, it's more than 1 chair. Do I need to go experiment with every single 2 things to see that it's larger always than 1 thing? No, you know it to be true. It's a necessary truth because it just makes sense to be true. And then how about this one? The shortest path between every 2 points is always a straight line. I mean, just think about it. Think about it. How do you know that's true? Because you think about it and it just seems so true through the intellect. right? With clear and distinct perception. You don't have to measure every 2 points that have ever existed to know that the shortest path between them is always a straight line. It just rationally, necessarily has to be true. You see the power of this, say the rationalists. The rationalists say this is powerful because you can know things to be true necessarily. And it's not dependent on faulty perception. It's not dependent on subjectivity. It just has to be true, regardless of who you are, regardless of how you see and how you experience the world. It has to be true. How powerful is it to know things that have to be true? For lots of philosophers, especially people like Plato, this is a very important idea, necessary truths, especially when it comes to ethics. Because if you ever believed in in objective moral truths, isn't the only way to come to them, says Plato, through reason? If you want to say it is morally wrong to kill innocent children, and you want to condemn people who do that and say that's not right. If you want to ever say you should not rape um, innocent men and women, if you want to say that's an absolute truth, how do you know that? Did you find that someplace? Did you go search and see it, experience it? Or does it just rationally make sense to you? Plato has this belief that these moral truths, these ethical truths, they're out there for us to discover, and we discover them through reason. If we ever want to say cultures and civilizations make progress morally or ethically, that a country is getting better and better, or society is getting better and better, if that's ever at all a true statement, a true judgment to make, there has to be some standard by which you're judging it, right? It, it has to be improving upon some sort of scale where something is getting good and something is not so good. Well, how do you determine where the positive direction of growth is? How do you know that taking away more money from the poor isn't making the society good? How do we know that society is better when more of us have equal opportunity, more of us have an equal chance of being successful? How do you know that that's the right direction to go? Well, the only way you ever know is if there is some way of judging forward progress. So there has to be some way to determine where you're supposed to go, where the good is, and what the not so good is. And how do you determine what good is? How do you determine that it's better that people have equal opportunity and um, uh, people are enslaved? How do you know? Well, you, you don't go see it, do you? You think about it. It just makes sense to you what justice is. It just makes sense to you which direction to go in terms of behavior to be a more just society, right? It's through reason. If you want to believe in that at all. For a person like Descartes, he'll point to mathematical truths. For instance, how do we know that a squared plus b squared equals c squared? How do we know that's true? Isn't it through thinking alone? You don't go out in the world and go find a squareds and b squareds and see if they equal to c squareds. You don't keep measuring that and experiment. No, no, no. It's just rationally true. So all of these mathematical truths that we'd ever come up with, even these laws of physics that we ever come up with, a lot of mathematicians and physicists will say the truths were there. I just went and discovered them. But they didn't discover them necessarily through a telescope. They discovered them through thinking, through reason, through deduction. You don't dig up a squared plus b squared equals c squared. You think it through and it makes sense that it's true for right triangles. So do you see how rationalists have the sense of the importance and the potency of this approach to reason? You can avoid misperceptions, right? You can grow your knowledge just through reason without having to worry about the problems of perception, without the worry about problems of subjectivity. You can get to a sense of necessary truths. You can find truths that have to be sure, right? You can know things for sure. You can get certainty, and you can have a path to, understanding goodness and justice and morals, and you have a path to attaining knowledge of mathematics. And doesn't that seem like a very powerful tool? The rationalists will also say they get around a couple of other problems that plague empiricism. Do you remember the problem of induction? In science, science is based upon particular instances, right? Doing certain tests and then generalizing based upon those tests. So if I go out to find out where apples come from, I go to a place with apples and I notice they're growing from this tree. I go to another place with apples, I notice that the apple's growing from that tree. I go to another place with apples and I notice that the apple's growing from that tree. Even if I find an apple on the ground, right? The farmer tells me, oh yeah, that fell from the tree. Well, if every instance that I go look for where apples come from, I notice they come from trees, scientifically, what's your hypothesis? Your hypothesis is that apples grow from trees, right? That all apples grow from trees. The scientific knowledge is based upon that. You do a test with some viruses, right? You just try to find a way to deal with the coronavirus, the COVID-19. Well, we do studies and tests and do experiments, and then based upon the experiments, we say, hey, look, this thing that we're using seems to, you know, tear apart that virus, right? Well, how do we know that? Because we've done so many tests where it has torn apart that virus. We use so many different test subjects, and it's torn apart that virus in all those test subjects. So we would say, through that scientific process, that hey, this vaccine, this drug will help you deal with the virus. How do we know that? Well, it's through induction. You take the few instances that you've perceived, that you've experienced, and then you induce a generalized statement. The problem for empiricists is you cannot induce a generalized statement, such as all apples grow from trees, because the only way you can justify that is through experience. You have to see all apples. You have to watch them all grow from trees in order to make that statement. In order to say this vaccine is most likely going to help you or will help you, you have to see it being used on that person to say that to them, right? But the rationalists say, well, we don't have to rely on having to see it, right? We don't have to rely on watching you use it to know that it has a good chance of working on you, because we have all this past data. We have all of these, experiments that we can use as premises to say, look, this has worked 90% of the time, so there's a good chance it'll work on you. Why do we believe that? Because it just seems to make sense. It makes sense. If this worked in 90% of our trials, then you'll have a good chance of it working on you, or this will have a good chance of working on the population. It just makes sense. Let's take a look at another generalized knowledge statement. All brains have brain cells. Remember, the empiricists have trouble saying this sort of thing because they don't look at all brain cells. You can't go and break open every single brain that's ever existed to see that it has brain cells. But the rationalists will say, no, we can know that without having to open up brains. We can know that because it just makes sense that all brains have brain cells, right? What about causation? Remember, the problem with causation is that we see events followed by other events, but we don't see this thing called cause, do we? It's just an assumption we make. If you're an empiricist, you don't see it. So how can you ever justify believing in causation? Well, if you're a rationalist, you don't have to see it. You don't have to see a thing called causation. You just see one event followed by the other event. Like you take um, you take your headache medication, and then your headache goes away, and the next day you have another headache, so you take your headache medication, and then your headache goes away. So every time event A follows event B over and over again, you go, gosh, I guess the headache medication caused my headache to go away. It just makes sense. It just that series, that causal relationship just makes sense, right? You don't have to see this thing called cause in order to justify it. You don't have to see every other thing that's participating within the event to say that there's a causal relationship. It just makes sense to you that it does, right? So what do you think about rationalism? Do you think this is the best way of finding knowledge? Does it adequately deal with the problems that plagued empiricism, do you think? Well, philosopher David Hume doesn't believe so. And in our next lecture, we'll take a look and see that actually empiricist David Hume was actually the one who made the problem of induction more popular. That empiricist David Hume was actually the one that made the problem of causation more popular, the things that we've used to criticize empiricism itself. Yet he says that rationalism isn't the solution either. And we'll take a look at that in our next lecture.